Welcome, AlgaTalk listeners, to another episode. In this episode, we explore one of the mothers of phycology. In past episodes, Yvonne and I have talked about the fathers of phycology. This is because early science research was exclusively published by men. But since it's March, which is Women's History Month, we here at AlgaTalk want to highlight these early female scientists, these hidden figures of phycology. In this episode, we will explore the life of Ellen Hutchins, the first female botanist of Ireland. To help me in my exploration, I interviewed Frances Gallagher, who works with the annual Ellen Hutchins Festival. Without further ado, here's Ellen Hutchins, the algae queen of Bantry.
She was born at the end of the 18th century in Ballylickey, which is just outside Bantry. It's a beautiful part of the country. It's also quite remote, even now. Her father, Thomas, was a magistrate. He would have been quite well-to-do. He was regarded as, he was a popular man. He was a Church of Ireland tenant of a Catholic landowner, which was unusual. He was well regarded by what you might call the common people of Bantry. He died when Ellen was two years old, leaving his widow Eleanor with 8 children they had 21 children and 8 survived.
Wow.
Her mother was an invalid, as was one of her brothers, and she had the education of a genteel young lady of what was at the time the British Empire. She was sent away to school in Dublin, where, as far as we can work out, she nearly starved. She and one of her sisters were in a boarding school, which simply saved money by not feeding the children. And this was a fee-paying school. This was not poverty. This was just young ladies were supposed to survive on toast.
I found that very interesting that she was sickly as a child and it was from malnutrition, and that it was considered unladylike to have a healthy appetite. And when she's in school and she's kind of going through the sickness.
A friend of the family, Whitley Stokes, I think, was a GP, a general practitioner in Dublin at the time. And he visited them and basically rescued her and took her in and fed them, fed the 2 girls, but particularly Ellen, who had been quite near death. And she continued in his care, and again receiving both health care and the broader range of education you could get in a more cosmopolitan city like Dublin. She was introduced to people in the botanical gardens in Dublin. The Royal Dublin Society was in its very early stages at that stage. So she would have been introduced to learned people and brought along to meetings of people who discussed matters scientific. And her mentor himself was very keen on botanizing in the Wicklow Hills and on the beaches near Dublin, and would have introduced her to that as a healthy outdoor activity, again as part of her recovery, of her healthcare, rather than as a worthy thing in itself, I suppose. But botanizing and studying seaweeds was regarded as a fit pursuit for a young lady of good family, and she took to it, and she excelled. I think there was a turning point in her life then. This was in her early teens, and she just decided that she would learn everything she could know about the non-flowering plants. And she had a really fine eye and very good draftsmanship. Her skill in botanical drawings was extraordinary in any time. She produced a lot of good work and went on to return home to care for her ailing family members, where she had no mentors at all. And I think that meant she had no one to tell her not to do things.
Going just a little bit back to when Dr. Stokes, was he more friends with the father or the mother? I'm just curious.
He had been an acquaintance of the father. I don't know anything beyond that.
Right. No. Yeah. But it was after that the father passed away, and he had a connection
Yeah,
with this
I think he
doctor.
checked in on her really and found that far from doing well, these girls were in a bad state. And he had a family of his own. Some of them girls of around the same age, and he just brought her into the family and treated her as a daughter.
And then this was almost like, I mean, she had a rough start in the beginning of her life. This is kind of like almost the golden age when she kind of comes into her own. And that Dr. Stokes introduced her to James Townsend McKay.
Yes, a very important figure in Dublin society at the time. Perhaps not in society at large, but in the natural historians of the time. Yes.
James Townsend McKay published some of her work, and sort of started sending her samples around to different people that he knew.
He also supplied her with books, I think, with research material that was coming out at the time. One of the things to remember, people speak of female botanists as being amateurs and so forth, and it's true, but they weren't permitted to attend university. There was no program that they could have become more professional by, and they weren't permitted to join the Royal Societies. It just wasn't available to them. So they would always be involved with the absolute encouragement of a male mentor, either a family member in the cases of some of the later female botanists, or somebody like McKay. It's not as easy for a woman to become a botanist in that time as it is now.
Right, and a lot of her works were because of James McKay, connecting her to many people in the cryptogamia field of botany. She was contacted with she had a correspondence with Dawson Turner, many other people, but she had a really personal relationship with Dawson Turner. They corresponded, and not just about algae. They talked about everyday things, their favorite books, poetry.
Yes, the structure of everything, not just of plants. Yes, they really did have quite a close correspondence in a way that I think would not be unfamiliar to our time, where we have frequently quite close correspondences on media. They had the same thing on pen and paper. And
right.
I think they were close, but they never, as far as we understand, ever physically met.
Yeah. I read that, and I found that a little disappointing that they were kind of so close to each other in the scheme of things back then. Nowadays, we don't think Dublin and London being that far away from each other, but it's a little. I think it's a little disappointing that they never met. But they wrote a lot, and as far as I understand, when Ellen later got sick again, that he was the letters that he wrote to her were very important to her and helped her get through it to some degree.
I think that's true. I think he was a very important figure in her life. And I think perhaps the fact that there was no question of them physically meeting meant that she didn't have to worry about impropriety, which would have been terribly important to her class and time.
You're right. If they had met together, there would have been rumors about a romantic relationship because they were so friendly with each other. Which I guess
a slight hint of romantic involvement with a chap who was a distant cousin of hers, who was researching mollusks in Bantry Bay, and with whom she also had a small correspondence. But that chap she did meet, but I don't know enough about it. And again, we're so far displaced in time that it's very difficult to use our relationships as an idea of how they would have conducted theirs.
There only were connections between her and her cousin Taylor.
There was a romantic interest of hers, but I don't know again whether that has any root in reality or whether it's just an association that might have been. Anyway.
Right. Yeah. No. Yeah. This isn't the gossip column of Ellen Hutchins, but but it
later. Yes.
Yeah. Exactly. No, but it is interesting that her background in botany had both of them have a really deep connection to each other that sort of like Dawson Turner, you'd have rumors that they were in the same area. Same thing with Taylor. I think they also talked a lot about botany.
You and I both know that you can't talk about botany or indeed algae with everybody. There, you have to have a corresponding interest, or else it just bores people. So they found
Right.
it. Well, that was lucky.
It's nice to see that, you know, a part of her life, and I think, you know, she, you know, so advanced for her time, and smart and, you know, ambitious, that at least she had this kind of time to become something so big. I think that her life had finally made a turnaround so that she was able to explore more and have more connections and correspondence. I found it interesting that even being this, you know, outgoing woman at the time was a rarity. She still had like sort of genteel or ladylike characteristics. Like when originally she started sending samples to all these phycologists and botanists, they kind of not, I don't know if they requested, but they wanted to publish her name next to the samples, and she refused it in the beginning, which I found very interesting. And it's sort of like the other side of the coin, that she still had to be a part of the society that she lived in, and, you know, still had to keep to the social norms that were going on at the time.
She did change later on, I think probably under the instruction or advice of her male mentors. But a lot of her early work is unsigned, and that makes it very difficult to tell it from other people's work in collection. Some of the work in Q has been identified by Ellen Hutchins, who has made a study of her handwriting. A thing about the handwriting as well is, and this applies to a lot of the Dawson Turner letters, in order to save paper, we must remember that paper was an expensive commodity in its time. They cross-wrote their letters. They would write their letter top to bottom, as you or I would do, and then they turned it at right angles and wrote across the page, so that you have this incredibly difficult to decipher old ink on old paper written over itself. And Madeleine, as I say, has made a study of this and is now very talented at reading this code almost.
That's the way they decipher the samples that she sent to so many botanists, was she wrote the name of the plant, and that's the way that we're connecting that it's her.
She had a fairly distinctive style of painting as well, and some of the paper stock is also quite distinctive. But the main thing is her beautiful sloping italic handwriting, yes, which is something that Madeleine can distinguish now in collection. She and her husband Sean were in New York in January of this year, and they identified some of the specimens which were known to be in collection. The museums, or the specimens, the paintings, and some of the preserved material were hers, and were clearly hers when the handwriting was deciphered, but hadn't been recorded as being hers. It was all a little vague. And this is the same in Kew, the same in some of the Dublin collections, and they're turning up in other places, particularly in the north of England, where some, again, of people she corresponded with had bequeathed their collections to local museums or herbariums, and she produced a tremendous amount of work. She recorded their location with such precision that we can go back now and find descendants of those plants, or in some cases probably the same plants in the same locations.
It wasn't just like circumstance and all of a sudden she was just lucky to meet these people. She had a gift that made her a very skilled botanist and a phycologist. She had to have good drawing and painting skills. She had to be able to understand the different Latin names within the taxonomy that was just growing at that time in the early parts of phycology, and figuring out what the different seaweeds are. I mean, she not only had to have an artistic skill, she had to have analyzing skills. And it wasn't just luck. I mean, of course, luck came into it, but
luck came into it in that she had a little bit of money. She was able to survive without having to earn her living, or without having to become um, dependent within somebody else's house. That did happen, but not until much later. And she was able to have her own book collection. She corresponded, as you know, with people who were able to send her works, but she also had a collection of reference material. She was able to afford painting materials, and paper, which was quite a big deal. And I think probably most extraordinary of all was her microscope. She corresponded with both Mackay and others about acquiring a new microscope, which was going to be worth the equivalent of thousands of euros or dollars or pounds or whatever you want these days, possibly tens of thousands. So again, we're not quite sure what she was looking through, but she was certainly discussing very expensive equipment at a time when these things were hand-ground lenses and, extraordinarily, again, precise pieces of brass and glass that cost a lot of money and would have had to have been transported a long way very carefully. She had resources that were unusual for her time, but she knew how to use them.
She was so well educated and enthusiastic about, seaweeds and going out there and picking them up from the shore and collecting them. She really had a love for it. Of course, the rest of her life, as you know, gets a little bit, more darker or more stressed later on. That in 1813, her brother Emmanuel, her older brother, took possession of the Belated house that they had, and that originally she had gone back to Belated to take care of her mother.
I think this is something we'll not really go into very much because it's a complicated episode of Irish history. It was another failed rebellion, and it involved a French naval battalion anchoring in Bantry Bay. It is probably the reason for the many armed men involved in that standoff, Ballylickey House. It would have, for its time, been part of the Wild West of the British Empire, I suppose.
And the problems that she had, what I kind of see is that when she starts having these problems with her older brother, that sort of kind of doesn't treat his own mother in a nice way and his siblings.
I think he had been totally distracted by being part of the 1798 rebellion until that failed, and then he decided to go home and claim his inheritance. And unfortunately, that was where they were. It had been their inheritance too. And he really seems to have treated them appallingly. He went on to inhabit that house and spend what had been part of the family fortune after the death of his younger brother, his mother, and then Ellen. A second brother who took her in and who, with his wife, cared for her very well in her last years, lived nearby, but I think did not get on with Emmanuel. Emmanuel went on to die under what is described as mysterious circumstances in an argument about the ownership of Arab horses in Morocco in his 70s. So there's a whole, I don't know, HBO mini-series in that as well.
Yeah, no, just surrounding Ellen Hutchins' life. She has all these different, sort of episodes and stories that are going on that are that make her life, sometimes difficult but incredibly interesting. And she persevered through all of it until the end, which I kind of reading the story, kind of believe that may have added into why she got so sick after 1813. Stress kills, and she had a lot on her mind, and it's almost a pity that she died, shortly before her 30th birthday. Oh, so she did so much up to her before her 30th birthday. How much more could she have done if she had another 10 or 20 years? Encompassing her life, that she had many different connections and was very important to phycology and where it went.
There's a group called Hutchinsia, which have actually been renamed again, which are little spurgy things that grow on high ground, and they were named for her. Quite a number of algae were named for her.
Yeah, I have them actually here. It's the Dacia Hutchinsia.
I would say Hutchinsia, but I'm not sure.
Hutchinsia. What's interesting to me is like now we're learning about Ellen Hutchins, and she's now known for her importance in algae research, and I'm curious, when did her name start to become more popular?
My awareness of it came when Madeleine Hutchins revived her memory, I suppose, for the Ellen Hutchins Society. Her 200th anniversary of her death was a time when they were looking to sort of celebrate Bantry in various ways. And Madeleine, who had kept up, some of the others of the family still live in and around Bantry. She suggested this as being a way of, I suppose, making the festival about more than just seafood.
Right.
Bringing in an important person from the past who was insufficiently celebrated by her,
contemporaries. Yeah, even back then she was celebrated by them. There's many quotes about her from William Jackson Hooker, and Dawson Turner mentioned her. William H. Harvey even mentioned her, who's known as...
And compliment how she was extraordinary, but nobody was to tell her that she was, lest she, become too self-important or something like that.
Yeah, it seems like they were doing that. Yeah, that some of the quotes are like, we don't want to name her too much because then she becomes too famous. Like, they almost knew how... Right, yeah, how prolific she would be if only these people knew about her. I find that amazing, and she kind of, I don't want to say went along with it, but she was part of the society of that,
I think she was aware that as a woman at the end of the world, she really was there by the grace and favor of the great men. And some of them were very much her allies, but not all of them. So she kept up her correspondence and kept her head down and kept recording.
All these scientists that were men tried to include, or maybe they couldn't even stop from including women in the early parts of the science, that they were even trying to root for them and try to be in their corner. I found it interesting that W.H. Harvey has one of her collections, many collections, after she passes away, and then when I think he passes away, he sends it to Margaret Gatty, who's also important in phycology. And it's sort of almost continuing the importance of women in phycology.
I suppose he would have seen her as a sort of natural heir, which she was in many ways. It is an interesting aspect of things. I've discussed this with a couple of historians who would say that, 18th, 19th century, the pursuit of health was becoming a respectable way of spending time, that going to the seaside to breathe the salt air and improve one's health was something that anybody with a little spare money was encouraged to do. And botanizing was something that ladies were allowed to do. And I think if you teach a sufficient number of people how to do something, you will get ones who do it marvelously well. You can't have virtuosos without having a lot of people who are only so-so. And I've no doubt that a lot of, not so much her generation, but the 19th century ladies, many of them did perfectly adequate watercolors, but an awful lot of them were taught to paint. And so you were able to get the few who were just superb. And that's something that led into the phenomenon of there being female botanists. From before, there were female natural science graduates from university.
Like you were saying, Margaret Gatty, there's many other women that were important to phycology, but she does stand out as someone, not only one of the earliest, but also one of the one of the most important, if not the most important, to start. And I hope to maybe discuss with you in the future episodes about more women in phycology that come up. I mean, now in modern days, you know, uh, you know, surprisingly, women are allowed to publish their works under their own name. So
And so many of us don't make anything like as much of our almost unlimited scope as she did of her very narrow avenue for moving forward. I would be interested in discussing this again during the Ellen Hutchins Festival, which will happen in August, as it has done for the last few years. And there will be others there who are far better able to talk about Ellen Hutchins than am I, including Madeline Hutchins, a descendant of one of her brothers.
And I very much look forward to talking to those people and having awareness about women in algae research, become more prominent, and having these women have a name that sticks out and we know about them. I think is very important. And like you were saying, there is a festival about Ellen Hutchins
in Bantry itself, but parts of it will be in Ballylickey, and parts of it we hope to have a sort of a tent on a beach, and I'll be able to spend some time talking about seaweeds there, and particularly about edible seaweeds, because at the time when Ellen was botanizing the seaweeds of Bantry Bay, rural Ireland had a far bigger coastal population even than it has now, and of those people, an awful lot would have foraged for both shellfish and seaweed as part of their diet. So she would not have been on a windswept, isolated beach. She would have been on a busy patch of what you might almost regard as market garden type levels of busyness, where people were harvesting seaweed for public consumption. It would have been part of the Irish diet since time on Irish beaches began. And there's an 12th century manuscript in which a monk is writing a guide to the day. So a monk would spend a time gathering seaweed, a time feeding the poor, a time in prayer, and a time in sleep.
And if anybody wanted to contact the Ellen Hutchins Festival to either help in any way they can, or where could they contact?
You can get them through the Facebook page, which is, I think it's Ellen Hutchins 200. Anyway, if you put in Ellen, it'll bring you the rest of it. And they also have an actual website.
Yeah, I see here, ellenhutchins.com. I'm sure that the listeners of the AlgaTalk podcast would love to hear more or see more from this festival, and more about early women in algae. Hopefully we can do that in the future. Thank you so much for doing this, and hopefully we'll talk again. Is there anything you'd like to add?
No, just thank you for putting on this podcast and allowing us to discuss with other interested people these small but extraordinary